As you know, we're in the series Counterculture Christians, and this is the macroevolution session we're going to cover. We've covered truth and religion, God, the Bible. We're going to cover macroevolution. We, a couple of weeks ago, started this session. We got about halfway through it, and so let's kind of update as to where we are. We're titling this session, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be a Darwinist. And as I mentioned last time, most of what I'm going to talk about is in chapters 3 to 6 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So if you want more on this, you can go there. Although there's a lot of new material that I'm bringing in here, as well as some video clips we'll see. Also, I want to reiterate one thing that we talked about last time. We're going to come back to this tonight. This idea that science is built on philosophy. I may have mentioned this a number of weeks ago, that I think that the debate between the Darwinists and the people who would consider themselves creationists or intelligent design people is not a debate over evidence. I think everybody's looking at the same evidence. It's a debate over philosophy. And I think that'll come out clear tonight, that philosophically what's going on here is that the folks who are Darwinists, those who think that there is no intelligence behind new life forms, are philosophically ruling out intelligent causes before they look at the evidence. So whenever they look at the evidence, they always come to the same conclusion: it's gotta be a natural cause. We're going to come back to that. But let's just take a look. And as I mentioned also, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. Remember that. Science doesn't say anything, scientists do. Scientific discoveries or scientific data always needs to be interpreted by somebody. And unfortunately, sometimes the philosophical presuppositions of the scientists cause them, I think, to come to wrong conclusions. And we'll see as we go. Here's our outline. And last time we covered what should a good theory of origin be able to explain. We'll review that briefly tonight. What is the evidence for the origin of life? And we pointed out last time that the simplest life we know about, like a one-celled amoeba, it's about the simplest life we know about. There may be something a little simpler, but the simplest independent life we know about has 1,000 volumes of an encyclopedia worth of information in it. So to believe that that resulted by natural forces without intelligent intervention is like believing that the Library of Congress resulted from an explosion in a printing shop. Okay? That's what we covered last time. If you want more on that, you can get the tape from last time, and ultimately these will be available in DVD. Tonight we're going to talk about the 6 reasons why Darwinism is not a good theory of origin. 6 reasons that you can mark down and say, here's why I am not a Darwinist. Here's why I don't believe that there wasn't intelligence involved in the propagation of new life forms. Now, last time we were here, we said the true worldview must explain all of these things. It must have proper explanatory power and explanatory scope. It must be able to explain where the universe came from, out of nothing, the extreme fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of order and the 4 natural forces. You know, in order to do science, the world has to be orderly, right? If things just happen randomly, there'd be no way to figure out causes, and that's what science does. It looks for causes. So this world is orderly. Why is it orderly? Also needs to explain the origin of reason and the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics, needs to explain where objective morality came from, the origin and design of life and consciousness. Why are some things conscious? You ever think about that? I mean, all the chemicals that make you are the same chemicals you can find in dirt. Why are you conscious? Why are some creatures conscious and others not? The origin and design of new life forms is really what the Darwinists say that they can explain. They can't explain any of the other 9 things on here. The origin of intelligence. Where did mind come from? And how about the origin of personality? How do you get personality from blind forces? Why do we all have a different personality? Where does that all come from? You would think that if it's just blind forces at work, everybody would be the same. But that's not the case. We're going to look into number 8 because that's what the Darwinists say they can explain. And they say they can explain it by natural selection. What is natural selection? Maybe we ought to define what it is. Here's a dictionary definition of natural selection. The process in nature by which, according to Darwin's theory of evolution, only the organisms best adapted to their environment tend to survive and transmit their genetic characteristics in increasing numbers to succeeding generations, while those less adapted tend to be eliminated. Now, as you can see, I've highlighted a phrase in there. Transmit their genetic characteristics. What does that imply? It implies that a creature needs to have genetic characteristics before it can transmit them, right? Natural selection can only work once you have life. It has nothing to do with the formation of new life, or at least the first life, because you need genetic characteristics before you can transmit them, right? So the bottom line here is, and we'll see this theme repeated over and over again, is natural selection may help explain the survival of the species, but not the arrival of the species. And you'll see what that means here in a few minutes. The main point here is that you got to have genetic characteristics before you can transmit them. What's the common example that evolutionists always give? Antibiotic resistance, right? Bacteria become resistant to antibiotic. That's an example of natural selection. And the bacteria that become resistant or are resistant because some sort of genetic mutation to this antibiotic, they don't get killed off, so they multiply, and the ones that get killed off go away, and therefore you have a new strain of bacteria that are resistant to this antibiotic. But what never happens is this. You never get bacteria, or you never get anything other than bacteria. The bacteria that survive are the ones that are just capable of surviving due to some sort of genetic advantage, but they don't turn into another type of species. In fact, it's shown that those bacteria, when that antibiotic is taken away, some of them will revert back to their original genetic makeup. They don't get any new genetic information. They're still bacteria from the very beginning to the very end. And you'll see why that natural selection, that process, will not create a new life form. In fact, here are the 6 reasons why Darwinism is not a good explanation of origin. And we're going to go through each of these individually. They won't take long. But I'll list them right now. Genetic limits, and then we'll go through them. Number 2, change is cyclical, not directional. I just kind of hinted at that. Yeah, you may get some bacteria that outpopulate the bacteria that are not resistant, but then once the antibiotic's taken away, they go back to the way they were. In other words, the change is cyclical, not directional. Number 3, there's something out there called irreducible complexity. And you can, if you guys are going to high school right now or college, wherever you're going, and you're going to get some sort of biology teacher trying to tell you that you got here by some sort of natural process without intelligent intervention, probably one of the best arguments against it is irreducible complexity, which we'll talk about. Number 4 is there's molecular isolation at the protein level between the basic types of creatures out there. In other words, at the molecular level, there's no evidence of an ancestral relationship. Number 5 is the sudden appearance of fossils. If Darwinism were true, we should see a gradual progression in the fossil record from the simplest life forms to the most complex life forms over a long period of time. We don't see that at all. In fact, you're going to be amazed at some of the things in the fossil record when we get there tonight. Number 6, there's not enough time for mutations to create these new creatures that the Darwinists say are created. Again, the theme here is natural selection may help explain the survival of the species, but not the arrival. So let's take a look at number 1. This is genetic limits. And this is where the Darwinists create a lot of confusion. You see this magazine right here? This is National Geographic. This is from a few years back. This happens to be 2004, I believe, November 2004. National Geographic, was Darwin wrong? Now, what do you think they answered? They said, no, Darwin was not wrong. Okay? You know what their primary evidence is for Darwin not being wrong? Here it is. You say, what? A bulldog? How is a bulldog evidence for Darwinism being correct? What they're talking about here is dog breeding. That somehow dog breeding is evidence for macroevolution. Let's take a closer look at this. Does evolution occur? Dog breeding for them is an example of evolution. You start with one basic maybe type of dog, and then through a long period of time, you can get these different types of dogs. Actually, they say it doesn't take a long period of time because breeders can create these new types of dogs rather quickly, from a very small dog like a Chihuahua to a very large dog like a Great Dane. And you may not know this, but actually those two dogs are in the same species, and they can interbreed. Although I don't know who would ever want to do that, especially for the poor little, if the female was the Chihuahua, that wouldn't work. Okay? But that's the same species there, or the same type of animal. And they're saying because of this, breeding in a short time, we should be able to get macroevolution in a long time. This is their basic argument. And you can see here, you have dogs here, but on the one on the right here, this tree of life on the right, you have these simple creatures, and ultimately they branch out into all these other creatures, and so we are all ancestrally related. That's basically Darwinism, that there's a common ancestor to all living biological things. And we didn't descend from apes, they will say, but apes or chimps and man have a common ancestor somewhere down here. And we're all interrelated. Okay, now this may appear to be persuasive on the face of it, but there's a fundamental flaw in this reasoning. Can anyone figure out what the fundamental flaw is? What's that? Yeah, the ones on the left are still all dogs. That's true. There's a genetic limit here, and it's even greater than that, though. While this is true, breeding in a short period of time can come up with all these different types of dogs. The one on the right is not true. Here's the big but. Notice the one on the left. If intelligent breeding meets genetic limits, and it does, even intelligent breeders cannot breed outside, can't take dogs and turn them into another type of creature. They can't turn them into cats or wolves or gorillas or alligators, right? There's a genetic limit. They can get as small as a Chihuahua and as large as a Great Dane, but they can't go beyond that despite all their intelligence. So here's my question. If the folks who are intelligent run into genetic limits, why do we expect non-intelligence to exceed those limits? Remember, Darwinism occurs without intelligence. There's no intelligence going on. It's random mutations acting over long periods of time. So if you run into limits with intelligence, how do we expect non-intelligence to exceed those limits? It does not seem to make any sense. The bottom line is this, and here's a critical distinction. The critical distinction is between micro and macroevolution. Microevolution is adaptation within a type. It's an observed process where life forms experience limited genetic variations that allows them to adapt and survive the stress caused by environmental changes. But macroevolution is adaptation into a new type. It's like from a cat going to a dog. It's an extrapolation from microevolution that has never been observed. It's the ultimate just so story by Darwinists. Now, if anyone ever asks you, do you believe in evolution, what should you say? What do you mean by evolution? If you mean change over time, yes, I agree. But if you mean, which would be, say, microevolution, yeah, that's been observed. We can see that. We can see microevolution. But if you mean that we're going from the goo to you via the zoo, that all of us are related ancestrally by some sort of blind, random process, no, I don't agree with that. You know, common ancestry could be true. I don't think it is. But that's a separate question from whether or not we all evolved with intelligence or without intelligence. I don't think common ancestry is true. I don't think we're all interrelated. In fact, we'll get into that a little bit later. But even if that were the case, there are some out there who believe we do have a common ancestor, but it's been intelligently guided to get us to where we are now. So here's the summary. Microevolution is true. It's within a type. Yes. Macroevolution across types? No. Never been observed. So that's the fundamental, and that, ladies and gentlemen, that was their main argument in this article right here. Now, can you see right now that philosophically, that is a conclusion that a scientist needed to make? And he didn't catch that there's a difference between an intelligently guided process like breeding, which runs in genetic limits, and a non-intelligently guided process. That's a philosophical problem. The second one has to do with cyclical change. And here's a picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say, right? I wonder if that means that one word is worth 1,000th of a picture. I don't know. But here's a picture of what happened to Darwin's finches. You've heard of Darwin's finches? Darwin noticed in his Galapagos trip that in different areas of the Galapagos, he had finch beaks, or certain populations had bigger finch beaks than other populations. And he ultimately came to the conclusion that there's a common ancestor somehow because of this data and some other data he observed. But what you notice here is that during a dry year, the finch beaks tended to be bigger. Now, why do you think that was? Because when the ground is dry, a bird that had a bigger, stronger beak could go deeper to get food. And one that had a weaker, smaller beak couldn't go deeper to get food and therefore died off. So what you had was a changing proportion between the large beak finches to the small beak finches. What you never had were finches becoming other types of creatures. Right? And the wetter year, the proportion of the big beak finches to the smaller beak finches was reduced. You had fewer big beak finches and more smaller beak finches. Notice that you start with finches and you end with finches, but the origin of finches is never explained. Where did finches come from in the first place? That's the key question, isn't it? So just because you have these varying depths of beak, that doesn't say anything about where finches came from in the first place. Change is cyclical rather than directional. They don't go to form another type of creature. That's number two. Number three is this concept of irreducible complexity. And here's what Darwin said a number of years ago, obviously about 150 years ago. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight changes, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, Michael Behe in 1996 wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. Michael Behe is a biochemist or a microbiologist. I can't remember what his official title is, but he teaches at Lehigh University. And he released this book in 1996, and Darwin's Black Box, he called it Darwin's Black Box because when Darwin was on the earth, the cell was like a black box. It just did things, but you couldn't see in it because we didn't have the technology to see in it. But now, due to our technology, we can peer into the black box and see exactly what goes on in a cell, and we are amazed. A cell is far more complex and far more designed than anything human beings have ever created. We've broken into the black box. And what we found is that inside the cell, we have an astonishing array of interrelated processes going on that do not appear to have come from short, successive steps. In other words, all of the functions and all of the parts of the cell need to be in one place in working order at the same time in the right proportions in order to have a cell. You can't get there gradually. And one of the examples that the intelligent design movement uses is a bacterial flagellum. And this is a E. coli bacterium cell, the width of which is 1/1000th the width of a human hair. So this little cell right here, you could line up over 12,000 of these in 1 inch. That's how small they are, okay? And On this microscopic cell, or within this microscopic cell, you have 240 distinct proteins. And as you can see, you have a microscopic outboard motor on its tail. That thing is just the tail of this microscopic cell, this thing right here. That's just a visual representation of it, a graphic representation of it. And this particular tail runs at an incredible 100,000 revolutions per minute. And what it can do, amazingly, is it takes only a quarter turn to stop, shift directions, and start spinning at 100,000 revolutions per minute the other way. And it is what is known as being irreducibly complex. It must have been created all at once, because you can't get this type of function unless all these pieces of the little motor are in place at the same time in the right proportion. Otherwise, you don't have a bacterial flagellum. You don't have this little motor running. The motor, it's like your car. Your car is irreducibly complex. You can't drive to work with just like a gas pedal or a brake or a steering wheel or tires or just one spark plug and nothing else, right? All of the parts of your car have to be there at the same time in working order in the right proportion to get you anywhere. Now, take a look at this in a little bit more detail. Do we have any engineers in here? If you're an engineer, this will make sense to you. I'm not an engineer, but it still makes some sense to me. You can see you've got a filament, which is like a propeller. It spins. You have a hook, a universal joint. You have an outer membrane. You have a bushing, which has an L ring and a P ring. You have an inner plasma membrane. On the rotor, you have both an S ring and an M ring, and the stator has studs and a C ring. This is something a mechanic would build. This is not something that comes into existence without intelligence, out of nowhere, in successive gradual steps. You have to have all these pieces in working order in the right proportion in order to have any function at all. Now, there's even a greater example of irreducible complexity than this cell, this one cell here. And it goes back to the origin of life. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. One of the problems with origin of life researchers is there's a chicken and egg problem, because proteins need DNA to function, DNA needs proteins, DNA needs RNA, RNA needs DNA, RNA needs a cell needs RNA, a cell needs proteins, and they all need the cell. They're just interrelated, they're irreducibly complex. Everything seems to have been created at once. You can't get there in successive steps and still have function the whole way. Oh yeah, you can build a car piece by piece, as we do in Detroit, right? But that doesn't mean you can drive the car as you're building it. There's no function there. That's irreducible complexity. And despite what has been said by some on the internet, this has never been answered adequately. In fact, here's the author, Michael Behe, of the book from Lehigh University, and here's what he wrote in his book, Darwin's Black Box. The result of these cumulative efforts to investigate the cell, to investigate life at the molecular level, is a loud, clear, piercing cry of design. The result is so unambiguous and so significant that it must be ranked as one of the greatest achievements in the history of science. The discovery rivals those of Newton and Einstein. And I don't think he's overstating the case. When you see some of these microscopic motors that are irreducibly complex, you know, man, this was not put together piecemeal by some random process. Intelligence seems to be behind this. Again, if you rule out intelligent causes before you look at the evidence, philosophically, if you rule them out like the Darwinists do, they never come to this conclusion. But is that a result of their philosophical presupposition or a result of the evidence? See, I think it's a result of their philosophical presupposition. So that is number 3. Number 4 is molecular isolation. There's no ancestral relationships at the protein level. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but I know people that are. And Michael Denton is a man who wrote a book. He's actually an atheist, this guy Michael Denton. But in 1985, he wrote a groundbreaking book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And in this book, here's what he writes. He said, at the molecular level, which is comparing protein sequences, there is no trace of the evolutionary transition from fish to amphibian to reptile to mammal. That's what, of course, Darwinists always say, we got here from fish to amphibian, from reptile to mammal, and from reptile to mammal. So amphibia, always traditionally considered intermediate between fish and the other terrestrial vertebrates, are in molecular terms as far from fish as any group of reptiles or mammals. To those well acquainted with the traditional picture of vertebrate evolution, the result is truly astonishing. And in Denton's book, he has these charts. And when you look at these charts comparing protein sequences, you go, there is huge gaps between all these types of creatures. It's almost like there's some sort of space between them, like there's some sort of molecular space that can't be traversed. They are in separate categories. They're not all blended. There doesn't appear to be any ancestral relationship, especially the typical ancestral relationship from fish to amphibian to reptile to mammal. That does not exist at the protein level. Now, here's what Richard Dawkins has said. He is probably the most well-known advocate of Darwinism in our culture today. The reason we know for certain that we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. Here's where philosophy will come in again. What is Dawkins saying here? And by the way, he said this in an interaction, an email interaction between he and Philip Johnson, who is one of the pioneers of the intelligent design movement. He wrote a book in 1991, did Philip Johnson, called Darwin on Trial. You may have seen it. It kind of was a book that really became a very popular book and a new book on this whole topic of Darwinism that spurred a whole number of other books. Now, Johnson, at the time, was a law professor at Berkeley. And you say, how could this guy know about evolution? Because he saw that the problem in evolution was not a problem over evidence. It was a problem, again, over philosophy. And he really hammered all these philosophical presuppositions that the Darwinists have and showed them that their conclusions are based upon what they think before they look at the evidence. So in any event, he had this interaction with Dawkins, and here's what Dawkins wrote to him at one point. He's basically saying because we all have a common DNA, that means we're ancestrally related. So let's take a look at this particular question. What about DNA similarity? How many times have you heard, we're 96% just like chimps? Now, what's the implication of that? Well, the implication is if common ancestry is true, right? Implication is we have evolved from them. Well, let's take a closer look at this issue. First of all, what is never answered by the Darwinists is this question. What's the origin of DNA? Where did this code come from? Because it's really like software. It's an information code. In fact, Bill Gates at one point said something like DNA is a software code far more complex than anything we've ever created. Where does the code come from? Where does information come from? They never answer that question. They just say, well, we've all got the same code. We must have come from the same being or, from the same one-celled creature originally. Now, secondly, DNA similarity is about 96% between apes and humans, but also about 90% between mice and humans. Now, why is that? Because of the complex ways cells use genetic information, very small genetic differences can produce big functional differences. Also, there's something out there, not to go too technical here, but there's something out there that some scientists have called junk DNA. They say only a very small portion of our DNA codes for proteins. The rest is useless junk. You know what they're finding now? That's not the case at all. They're finding that much of what they used to think was junk actually does a lot in the organism. So if you hear this term junk DNA thrown around, don't necessarily believe it. There's a lot more research that needs to be done in this field, but the bottom line here is that it doesn't appear that much DNA is junk as was once originally thought. Also, there's some other technical things related to DNA similarity that we don't really have time to get into here, but I want to point out the real main point on this issue, and here's the main point on this issue. DNA similarity could be evidence of a common designer rather than a common ancestor. You ever notice that? In other words, this evidence could work for either side of the debate. You could say that a common genetic code could be evidence of a common ancestor, but a common genetic code could also be evidence of a common creator or a common designer, couldn't it? I mean, if there is a designer out there, does he have to give each individual creature a different genetic code? If he did, could there be a food chain? Maybe we have a common genetic code because we have a common designer. And maybe certain structures like chimps, who tend to walk on 2 feet like we do, have DNA that may be closer to ours because that genetic blueprint is what helps them walk upright. I mean, I don't know, could be. So just because you have common genetic code does not necessarily mean you have a common ancestor. It could, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. In fact, when you go out there and you look in this parking lot and you see all the different cars out there, they all have four wheels, don't they? They all have an engine, they all have a drive shaft, they all have steering wheels. Does that mean that they have a common ancestor, or is there a common designer among all these different car companies? There's a similar design that is modified by intelligent people for the purposes of transportation. Well, it could be that we have a common genetic code with certain variations that are modified by the designer so we can live as he intends us to live. In fact, to continue, could a food chain exist without a common genetic code? I don't know. Maybe not. Without a common genetic code, maybe we couldn't have a food chain. Also, what is often overlooked is that the Darwinists must explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. The bee, the octopus, the Venus flytrap, mildew, the peacock, the porcupine, the human are all supposed to have come from the first common ancestor. How do you get this incredible diversity of life? By natural forces, without intelligent intervention. I mean, when you think about what's out there, all the different creatures that are out there, do you really think that you're related? You have a common ancestor with mildew? Do you really think that? Mildew to the porcupine, to the seahorse, to the octopus, to the Venus flytrap, to the bombardier beetle. Think about all the diversity of life. The peacock, the sea otter. I mean, there are some bizarre things out there. The stonefish. You know the stonefish? You step on a stonefish, you're dead. Some of the things in the sea are just amazing. Yeah, you say, well, we look like apes. Yeah, we look like apes, but that's only because we don't look like snakes in trees. But according to the Darwinists, we're related to them as well. So similarity doesn't necessarily prove common ancestry. It might, but even if we do have a common ancestor, that doesn't mean we weren't intelligently created. You see this right here? Any Corvette fans? Okay, this is a progression of the Corvette from the 1950s to the 1970s. And Darwinist Tim Barra offered the progression of the Corvette as evidence of descent with modification. Can anyone see the flaw in his thinking here? What's the flaw? Why should you never use this as evidence for Darwinism? Yes, it's intelligent design. This is now known as Barra's blunder because this is evidence for intelligent design. Were these things formed by the wind and the rain? No. These things were formed by intelligent designers, car makers, who then took one design and modified it progressively from year to year. Car makers still do this. This is evidence of intelligence. It's not evidence of a random, blind process. My co-author of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Dr. Norman Geisler, once had a debate with Paul Kurtz, who is a secular humanist up at the University of New York at Buffalo. He's one of the secular humanists out there, been around a long time. And they had a debate over this issue. And Kurtz said, you can see evolution. You can see evolution in the airplane industry from the Wright brothers to today's 747. And Geisler said to him, that's evidence of intelligent design. He said, no. You could see the progression. He said, yeah, but who designed those planes? Engineers designed them. You're giving evidence for intelligent design. All right, number 5, the sudden appearance of fossils. We've got genetic limits, change is cyclical, not directional, irreducible complexity, molecular isolation. There's no ancestral relationships. If that's not enough, how about the fossil record? Well, let's take a look at Stephen Jay Gould. This gentleman used to be probably the top evolutionist in the world, but he died about, say, 10 years ago. He taught at Harvard University. And this is a famous admission from Gould. He said that modern multicellular animals make their first uncontested appearance in the fossil record some 570 million years ago, using his dating. And with a bang, not with a protracted crescendo, this Cambrian explosion marks the advent of, at least into direct evidence, of virtually all major groups of modern animals, and all within the minuscule span, geologically speaking, of a few million years. The Cambrian explosion. If you haven't heard of this is a problem for Darwinists. In fact, there's a new DVD out called Darwin's Dilemma. Just came out last month, and I'm going to show you a couple of short clips on Darwin's Dilemma right now. In fact, let's take a look at the first one, and this first one will show you how all of these creatures came into existence virtually overnight, as if they were created. Take a look.
But late in the Precambrian, they disappeared from the Earth.
He's saying some plants went away.
After their extinction, everything changed in a geological instant. In a spectacular burst of creativity, the basic blueprints for most of the animal kingdom exploded into being. And for the first time, biologically complex structures like compound eyes, spinal cords, articulated limbs, and skeletons appeared on Earth. To understand the speed of the Cambrian explosion, imagine the history of life compressed into a single day.
If we imagine the whole history of life on Earth taking place in one 24-hour period, the current standard estimates for the origin of life put it at about 3.8 billion years ago, let's say 4 billion. So if we start the clock then, our 24-hour clock, 6 hours, nothing but these simple single-celled organisms appear, the same sort that we saw in the beginning. 12 hours, same thing. 18 hours, same thing. 3/4 of the day has passed, and all we have are these simple single-celled organisms. Then at about the 21st hour, in the space of about 2 minutes, boom, most of the major animal forms appear in the form that they currently have in the present. And many of them persist to the present, and we have them with us today. Less than 2 minutes out of a 24-hour period. That's how sudden the Cambrian explosion was.
That's Jonathan Wells, who is a PhD from University of California at Berkeley and wrote the book, The Icons of Evolution. He has a PhD in biology, so he knows what he's talking about. And Gould, the Darwinist I just mentioned before, actually admits, yes, this is what's going on. In the Cambrian explosion, everything exploded into being, it seems, in a very short order of time. All these body plans just showed up. It seems like out of nothing in the fossil record. Now, Gould realized this, and he came up with a theory to try and deal with it. It's called punctuated equilibrium, which means that sometimes evolution makes these leaps rather than this slow, gradual process that Darwinism had thought of, or Darwin had thought of, this slow, gradual process. He's saying, no, sometimes it makes these great jumps. Of course, Gould had no mechanism for this. There's no way they could do this, at least from any evidence we saw. We didn't see any natural mechanism that could cause these great jumps. But he said, because of the fossil record, we have to assume them. Well, wait a minute. Well, why do we have to assume them? Because we're ruling out intelligence, remember? Philosophically, we're ruling that out before we look at the evidence. So it's got to be a natural cause. So we're just going to say, because we see these spikes, because we see these great leaps, it's got to be a natural cause. We'll just call it punctuated equilibrium. There's no evidence for this. And this next piece of the clip, I don't have time to show you, they were just going to show that, I think on 4 different continents where they looked for these fossils, they found exactly the same thing. They found all these life forms. In other words, this wasn't a local discovery. All around the world, they found 570 million years ago, according to their dating, bang, all these body plans just showed up. Here is another famous quotation by Gould. He said, "The history of most fossil species includes 2 features particularly inconsistent with gradualism." You know, Darwinism, really slow process. Here's what he said. Number 1, stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. 2, sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. In other words, they come into existence, it seems fully formed without any previous life, no gradual process. They just come into existence. They don't change as long as they exist, and then they just go out of existence. Sudden appearance, stasis, sudden disappearance. This is not what Darwinism predicted. And good scientific theories predict future discoveries. That's not what they found in the fossil record. It's against Darwinism. Here is another clip that will show you where the spikes occurred of all these different body plans.
Imagine a graph, if you will, of the appearance over time of phyla. In Darwin's picture, you'd have 1, then 2, then 4 perhaps, then 8, a gradually increasing curve of the number of phyla growing over time.
What you actually have in the fossil record is a sudden spike in the number of phyla that appear during the Cambrian, and then a few that trickle in across the rest of geologic time. This kind of discontinuity is radically at odds with the Darwinian picture of the history of life.
The pattern we see is the major body plans present at the beginning, and that the organisms that we know today fall into one or another of those major body plans. They don't gradually increase over time.
Those 2 gentlemen, the guy you just saw there a second ago was Paul Nelson. He is a fellow at, I think, the Discovery Institute in Seattle, which is kind of an intelligent design think tank, as is the other gentleman, Stephen Meyer, who just wrote a book called Signature in the Cell. It's about this big on the origin of life. And brilliant guys who really realize there's got to be intelligence behind all this. Another quote by Gould and another short clip. This is probably the most famous quote by Stephen Jay Gould that almost everybody who has read anything in this field has or knows about. Here it is. "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils." In other words, Darwin's tree that we all hear about, that I had up here before, doesn't exist in the fossil record. Doesn't exist at all. Only the tips exist. And as Jonathan Wells will explain to us here, the better example or the better illustration of what's really going on is not a tree, but a lawn, where all these types just appear and they're not related. Let's take a look.
The basic body plan of the arthropod phylum has a segmented torso, jointed legs, and an exoskeleton, all of which arose suddenly at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And today we still see the continuity of this original plan, this foundational idea, in over 1 million species of animals.
This top-down pattern looks nothing like the predictions of Darwin's theory.
Darwin's theory is that there's a tree of life where you have one organism diverging into many other organisms and big differences appearing at the top. What we really see is from here up. This does not exist in the fossil record. If I were using a botanical illustration, it would be a lawn with separate blades of grass sprouting independently of each other. And those would be the phyla. Now, within each phylum, there is subsequent diversification, but even there, I don't see the branches connecting that would make them a tree of life.
Darwin was caught in the grip of a deep dilemma. The fossil record showed him one thing, his theory told him something else. He comes to an impasse at this point, and he says, if this pattern holds, it is a genuine argument against my view. And I think 150 years later, we've added a great deal more detail to the picture, but I think the basic problem is still unsolved.
And if we don't have gradualism, what do we have? Richard Dawkins will tell us. What we have here are things appearing seemingly out of nowhere in the fossil record. Now, notice what Wells said. He said, there is subsequent diversification in the phylum. What is that? That's microevolution. That's where you have maybe one type of dog, and then ultimately they branch off into other types of dogs. But that's not macroevolution. That's microevolution. Let's go back to our National Geographic piece. You're not going to believe what they wrote in here. I didn't believe it when I read it. But in addition to the dog, remember the bulldog I had up here? This is what they said about the fossil record. This is unbelievable to me, but this is what they said. And you can come up here and look at this if you want to make sure I'm not taking it out of context. Illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor. What? First of all, what's your definition of spotty? Let me ask you this. If you went to a movie, let's say you went to a movie you really wanted to see. One of my favorite movies is Raiders of the Lost Ark. You go into the theater, right? And they show you one frame out of every 1,000. So the movie is about 3 minutes long. Are you going to say, gee, that was a great movie. I got the plot and everything. I know exactly what happened. Or are you going to say, that wasn't a movie? How can you get the plot line when you've got only one frame out of every 1,000? You can't get the plot line. You can't know what happened. Oh, the Darwinists do know what happened. Why? Because they already have presupposed what has happened philosophically. They already know the answer. They're just looking for confirming evidence. Do you see where this is going? Now, here's my question. What would the fossil record look like if creation were true? Like it does. You would see all these things just pop up out of seemingly nowhere. I mean, what evidence would you need to prove creation? It would seem like that would be good evidence. So this idea that there's a tree out there, that's macroevolutionary theory, is not true. In fact, here's the true picture. Things just pop into existence, it appears, and may diversify from that point inside their type or phylum. So the true picture is there aren't missing links, there's a missing chain. You always hear about the missing links. No, there's a missing chain. There's no chain. I mean, if I had one link in New York, another link in Chicago, and another link in LA, would you say I had a missing chain or missing links? I had a missing chain. That's what we have going on here. So, what about ancestral relationships? Well, you know, the fossil record can't establish ancestral relationships anyway. Michael Denton again, the atheist I mentioned before, he said 99% of the biology of any organism resides in its soft anatomy, which is inaccessible in a fossil. You cannot determine ancestral relationships from bones, which is why this scientist who works for Nature magazine, a writer for Nature magazine, put it this way: to take a line of fossils and claim they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story, amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. So when they line up the bones of our supposed ancestors, the skulls, they don't know if they're ancestor related. I mean, here on the top, you have a macroevolutionary artist taking a particular liberties with the skull, and here's a design model artist. You don't know what's under the hood biologically just from bones. Just like when you look at a car, you don't necessarily know what's under the hood. You got to pop the hood up to see what's in there. And that's what DNA comes in. You don't necessarily get DNA from fossils. So you cannot establish ancestral relationships from fossils. And even with DNA, you don't always know if it's an ancestral relationship. You don't know whether it's a common designer or a common ancestor. Bill Dembski, who has written profoundly on this, in fact, this is a very good book, The Design of Life. He and Jonathan Wells, the guy you saw in the video, wrote this book. So if you want a good book on this issue, you want to get The Design of Life. In fact, I just spoke to Dembski about 2 hours ago. I was asking him a couple of clarification points on this because he knows it infinitely better than I do. He's one of the leaders in this field. Here's what he said about the evidence lacking for macroevolution. You know how they say, well, we got this particular fossil, and then way over here we got this particular fossil, and then over here we got this particular fossil. Maybe there's some sort of ancestral relationship going on. Here's what Dembski says. He said, what's needed is a complete, fully articulated evolutionary path and not merely a possible oasis along the way. To claim otherwise is like saying we can travel by foot from Los Angeles to Tokyo because we've discovered the Hawaiian Islands. You need an evolutionary path, not a just-so story. David Berlinski, who is an atheist, or an agnostic anyway, a Jewish agnostic, just wrote a book called The Devil's Delusion, a fun book to read, where he goes after the Darwinists. This book was so playful and so sarcastic and annoyed the Darwinists so much that they actually got the book spiked by the publisher. In other words, the publisher had printed 14,000 copies. They sold out virtually overnight. And they were about to run another set, and they got so many complaints from the Darwinists that they canceled the book. They got pressure, censorship, in other words. So Berlinski took his manuscript to another publisher, and it just came out again. I mean, the book was selling on Amazon after it had gone out of print for $600 because there were so few copies in print. Anyway, Berlinski has begged the Darwinists, you say that your worldview is true. You say that we got here by natural selection and mutation. Is that the mechanism that you think has got all of these incredibly complex and designed creatures, or at least they appear to be designed? Is that your mechanism? Because it doesn't work. There's not even enough time to do it. In fact, Michael Behe, and by the way, you do want to read that book if you want a good book. It's called The Devil's Delusion. It's a fun read. Let's go back to irreducible complexity for a second. We're talking about the fossil record. Here's what Behe said about irreducible complexity. He said, anatomy is quite simply irrelevant to the question of whether evolution could take place on the molecular level. So is the fossil record. It no longer matters whether there are huge gaps in the fossil record or whether the record is contiguous as that of or continuous as that of the U.S. presidents. The fossil record has nothing to tell us about whether irreducibly complex systems could have developed step by step. What the fossil record does tell us, it seems, is that intelligent design appears to be a better theory of origin than Darwinism. But even if the fossil record showed a gradual progression, that wouldn't necessarily mean that that gradual progression occurred without intelligence because of irreducible complexity at the molecular level. You know, those little motors that are going on in the cells can't get that way unless, again, all those pieces are put there at the same time in working order. There's not enough time for mutations. Here's what Dawkins wrote in his book, The God Delusion. We can deal with the unique origin of life by postulating a very large number of planetary opportunities. Once that initial stroke of luck has been granted, natural selection takes over. Now let me just sort of unpack this for you. Dawkins has no explanation from where the universe comes from. So he posits a very large number of universes out there and planets out there. Does he have any evidence there are other universes? No. But he just has faith there are. And because there's so many of these planets and so many of these universes out there, somehow life is going to come into existence by chance. Now, never mind chance is not a cause. Never mind that chance is just a word we use to describe mathematical possibilities, and it can't determine anything. It doesn't cause anything. Never mind that. Dawkins is saying somewhere in some universe, on some planet, we're going to get life without intelligence. And he assumes, well, it's got to be this life because we're here. Then he says natural selection can take over, and here we are, from the goo to you via the zoo. Let me show you why that does not appear to be possible. Again, another short clip from Darwin's Dilemma. Oh, it's luck. It's just throwing the dice here. Here's Darwin's Dilemma.
If you do the experiments and you analyze how much information is required to get, say, a new protein fold, it's just far beyond what you can get by random mutation and natural selection.
How far beyond? Axe published his findings in the Journal of Molecular Biology. He determined that among all the possible amino acid combinations, the probability of generating just one short protein by mutation is roughly 1 in 10 to the 74th power, or 1 chance in 100 trillion, 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 trillion.
To put that in context, there's only 10 to the 65 atoms in the entire galaxy. So to build a new functional protein by selection and mutation within the time allowed for the Cambrian explosion, what you're essentially having to do is equivalent to a blindfolded man looking throughout the entire galaxy for one marked atom. So what we're talking about is searching for a tiny, tiny needle in an enormous haystack and having a very limited time to search.
So on the question of something like the Cambrian explosion, there does not appear to be any way that unguided random mutations can accomplish what needs to be accomplished to explain new functional proteins. And certainly by extension, wherever in the history of life you would need to have multiple new protein folds, the probabilities multiply. So there's no reason to think that this is plausible.
Just if you do the math, it doesn't work. 10 to the 74th power. There's only 10 to the 65 atoms in the entire galaxy. There's only 10 to the 80 atoms in the whole universe. And so just by mutations, natural selection can't do the job unless there's intelligence behind it. That's the point.